Hi, thank you for joining us for Votebeat's virtual event on public trust in elections today. At Votebeat, our journalists have been covering the public's trust in elections, as well as the factors that influence it and why that trust matters for democracy. After the 2020 election, Republicans reported dramatically less confidence in the election results than Democrats. In 2024, that gap narrowed significantly, according to MIT's survey of the performance of American elections. The results also showed voters are most likely to trust the results of their local elections. Voters having trust in elections is vital to a strong democracy and to their participation in them. A report from the state's United Democracy Center found that people are more likely to vote when they are confident that their ballots will be counted as intended. To keep up with our reporting after today, please follow Votebeat on social media and subscribe to our newsletters at votebeat.org/newsletters. Also, we're a nonprofit newsroom, and our journalism relies on donations from and support from our readers. Please support our work and events like this one as you're able to by giving any amount at votebeat.org/donate. You can find those links by clicking in the resources tab in Zoom. Our editorial director, Jessica Huseman, will moderate a conversation with three panelists we're really excited to have here with us today. Professor Charles Stewart of MIT, the founder of the MIT Election Data and Science Lab, who oversees the survey of the performance of American elections, is joining us. Seth Bluestein, a Philadelphia City Commissioner who is one of a three-member board that oversees election operations and voter registration from the city of Philadelphia, is with us today too. And our third panelist is Brinson Bell, who until May was the executive director of the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Thank you all very much for being here with us today. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. I'm going to turn this over to Jessica and to our guests. They'll be joining us in just a moment.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here today. I'm really excited to have this very timely conversation with our three panelists. Thanks so much for being here, the three of you. You are three of the people that I rely most on for the information that I know about elections. So it's exciting for me that you guys are all three here in this room to talk about this really important topic. So I want to start off with a really big question that is probably the modal question we got as we asked people to submit questions for their as they signed up to participate, and it is, will there really be elections next year? I know that's a big one, but I feel like we should answer it first because it's kind of the question, right? And if somebody's worried about that, they're not really going to be paying attention to the rest of what we say during this panel. So why don't we kick that off? Charles, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Seth and then to Kenan.
So I'll give the same answer that I gave in 2020, in the spring of 2020, where people were asking the same question. And the answer at the time was, if the asteroids are raining down, the zombies are in the street, we're going to be having the elections in 2026 and forever. And I can elaborate on that, but
please elaborate.
Well, I mean, we have a constitution, we have laws, we have independent governments running the elections. We have expectations of politicians. We have consultants running campaigns who have millions of dollars to lose if there's not an election. There's a lot of reasons, a lot of things moving us toward having the elections. But the serious one is that the mechanisms, the requirements in place are constitutional. They're in the laws. And one can be concerned about the shape of guardrails in American democracy these days, but so far those guardrails have held, and I think there's every reason to believe they will.
Seth.
Yeah, I think when people ask that question, they're expressing fears about the direction of the country as it relates to the presidency. That was true in 2020. I think that's true today. But we vote for a lot of offices in this country. When you go to vote, you see on your ballot, not just voting for president, but all the way down through your local offices. There are a lot of governor seats on the ballot next year, congressional seats. We are absolutely going to have elections. In the Constitution, the rules related to how elections are run divides that responsibility between Congress and the states. And in most states, it's at the county level or smaller jurisdictions that actually run the elections. So from Philadelphia's perspective, there is nothing that's going to stop us from holding elections in Philadelphia for Philadelphia voters when that time comes. At least in Pennsylvania, we have elections every 6 months. So we're regularly fine-tuning our procedures, and we'll be ready to go.
Awesome. Karen?
Well, they've said so much. I don't want to sound like a broken record, but we will have elections. My background in elections goes all the way back to 2006. North Carolina has gone through a lot of congressional maps and other maps changes due to gerrymandering lawsuits and so forth. And the courts have stepped in and they have changed the maps, and we've still conducted elections and started filing all over again and so forth. So, I think what we have to remember is all the good things that the other panelists have said are spot on. But, when it comes to getting the work done, we may have to pivot. There may be some roadblocks that are put in our way, but we will see it through. We take an all hazards approach to conducting elections, and it's been pandemics, and it's been hurricanes, and it's been tornadoes and wildfires and so forth. But it's also been a lot of law changes in many of the states. And so, I'll just pull out the mantra that we had for my 6-year tenure as state elections director. We don't stop an election, we figure out how to proceed, and that's what'll happen across the country.
Great. Karen, I just want to stick with you for a second to talk about that 6-year tenure as the North Carolina Board of Elections Director. I want to talk about your exit a little bit, because I think that that's really sort of relevant to what we're talking about here with trust in elections. So can you explain to the audience sort of what your exit from that position looked like, and what implications you think it has for trust in elections writ large?
I'll try not to go too long on this, but a little bit of background for folks who don't know. North Carolina has a state board of elections that appoints the executive director to be the chief election official and administrator. So where most states are structured with elections under the Secretary of State, that is not the case in North Carolina. And so there have been 6 attempts in 9 years to change the appointment authority of the State Board of Elections. And for more than 100 years, the governor of North Carolina has appointed the state board, and then the state board is made up of 5 members, a majority representing the party of the governor. And then that 5-member board, once appointed, appoints the executive director to lead the day-to-day operations. The board itself is more of a quasi-judicial role. And I should say that these efforts to change the appointment authority happened with both Democrat and Republican governors. So this is really just a struggle between the state legislature and the governor's office, the executive branch. And so what happened in December of 2024, as part of the Hurricane Helene relief bill, which was well over 100 pages, there was a section inserted that moved the authority of appointment of the State Board of Elections from the governor to the newly elected auditor, who is of the Republican Party, which is the makeup of the legislature. And so the makeup of the State Board of Elections changed. And when the new board was sworn in, they took a vote for the term of the executive director and made a motion and passed the vote to appoint a new executive director. I think what drew a lot of added attention is that I requested to be able to speak at that meeting to really, it was not about me. I wanted to take a moment to recognize the, just enormous success of the state board and the county boards for the accomplishments in pulling off the election through Hurricane Helene, becoming a national award-winning state agency, just so much. Also in my tenure, there had been the 2 largest turnouts in any elections in North Carolina. And so there was just a lot that I wanted to take a moment to recognize, and I was not given that opportunity. And so, my reaction was I would stay. I had the remarks and I would give the remarks and give the recognition where it was due. And I think we would have been a page 2 story otherwise if they had just allowed me to speak. But because they didn't, it really took, some people really took offense to it. And I did not want to make any grandstand about it, but it really, I did feel like those folks deserved that moment of recognition, especially, if my time was coming to an end.
Okay, great. And do you think that how do you think this affected the trust that North Carolinians have in your board? Do they see it as more political, or is this sort of an extension of the politics that have been happening around the board, as you say, for several years?
So I should point out that the makeup of North Carolina voters now is more or unaffiliated than having an affiliation with either the Democrat or Republican Party. And so when you know that, you realize why North Carolina is considered purple and a swing state and so forth. And so this action really did, it was controversial on both sides. I'll also point out that one of the 6 attempts to change the makeup was actually put to the people on the ballot, and they said, no, don't change it, keep it with the governor. And so it really, the people are aware. They realize that the even just this authority issue has become a political ping pong ball, and it's raised a lot of questions. I will also say that I came into the state board role the only person. There had been 3 predecessors to me in that executive director role. So I was the 4th state elections director and the only one who had been a county election official. So I really came in with more experience than anyone had, used that background to, help further the best practices with the counties and across the state. And my successor actually came from the legislature, serving as counsel to the Speaker of the House, and has no elections background. And so that has also been something that hasn't set well with a lot of folks. I wish him well. There's a tremendous staff of civil servants ready to see elections through in North Carolina. But, the signal of selecting him over a longstanding election administrator was another signal to the people that politics have become a part of the process, and it really shouldn't. It is a nonpartisan job, and I will say, I hope they have the understanding that all of that may be going on back and forth between the legislature and the executive branch and so forth, but the nuts and bolts day-to-day operation are being carried out and conducted by bipartisan nonpartisan officials in the county and at the state office, and by the bipartisan officials that serve in our polling places and our voting sites in North Carolina and across the country. And so, at the heart of it, the folks should have confidence in what's going to be done, and that it's going to be, carried out like we have according to the law.
Charles, why don't you give us sort of an overview of what trust looks like right now? I know that you've been studying this for some time, and you've recently come out with some new survey findings on election trust. So give us an overview. How is trust right now? How does it vary by party? And how does it look now compared to 2020? Oh, you're muted.
You would think after 5 years of being on Zoom that we'd figure this one out, but yeah, thanks, Jessica. So there's a couple ways of thinking about this, and Carrie actually set this up in the introduction. That just to start, that voters are confident when they have a good experience, when people they trust, interpret the election in a positive way, and when their candidate wins. And that's kind of that's the basic scaffolding that political science tells us kind of moves things. And I think, the folks on the listening can kind of fill in the blanks there. But just very quickly, almost everybody has a good experience when they vote, which then redounds to the benefit of local election officials. There are controversies around the country. Votebeat does a great job in covering those controversies, but you're not covering most places because there aren't controversies in most places. Good experience. And that's what drives the high experience at the local level. But then there's, distrust about what's happening elsewhere. Maybe the next county over, next state over, what's happening, in New England, if I live in the middle of the state, middle of the country, and those sorts of things. And that's really where voters rely on, politicians, people in the media to interpret what's happening. And, with the polarization of news media, we're seeing much more partisan inflection into confidence in elections overall and in particular ways of voting. I mean, a good example being that over the last decade, Republicans have become nationwide really quite skeptical of voting by mail. And that derives directly from, President Trump being skeptical about this, expressing skepticism in 2016 and then moving on. And then, winning and losing. And we've seen that dynamic actually really begin to seesaw dramatically over the last decade, where Democrats and Republicans are beginning to interpret whether, the election was run fairly in terms of who won the election. And so those are the big things. The interesting thing that I'll just add to that gets to the state level and the local level. And with both Seth and Kenan on the call, I think that ends up being, the level at which election officials feel it. And in this way, kind of the partisan dynamics of trust and distrust have really evolved from 2016 to the present. And this is what I mean particularly. So my survey the performance of American elections. We asked several hundred voters in every state whether they are confident of local elections and state elections, et cetera. And if we look at the answers about confidence at the state level in 2016 and before, the dynamics are sort of what you would expect if you know something about state politics. So first of all, if you're in Illinois and a Republican, you're likely to be really skeptical when Democrats win because you're sure that they're stuffing ballot boxes in Chicago, right? Likewise, if you're a Democrat in say Texas, to pick on one state, you're watching the news. Oh my goodness. If you're a Democrat, there's something shenanigans going on. So there's kind of what I would call traditional grumpiness about being on the losing side, right? And especially in red and blue states. But that grumpiness did not lead to anger. It was just kind of grumpiness, right? And in these states, you would get kind of the out party telling stories, well, in Illinois, for Republicans, we really got to battle against the turnout machine in Chicago. And that's kind of the nature of the business. And I think Seth is in the middle of it in Philadelphia. And this is kind of normal politics, I would say. At the end of the day, the losing party generally, after a couple of months after the election, they've dusted themselves off and they're ready to fight the next election, right? In kind of a happy warrior manner. Things changed in 2020, right? Things changed in 2020. And what we saw in 2020 in my survey is that Republicans everywhere were grumpy. It didn't matter. They were grumpy in Texas. They were grumpy in Wyoming. Actually, they weren't grumpy in Wyoming. That was kind of interesting. But they were grumpy in Kansas. They were grumpy in Massachusetts. They were grumpy everywhere. They were a little more grumpy in states where Donald Trump lost by small margins, like Arizona. They were grumpier in states with a lot of vote by mail, so like Washington and Colorado. And Democrats were what I called irrationally exuberant about how well the election was run, on the other hand. Just nothing was wrong with elections, which actually, this is something a little hobby horse, and what I think has been underappreciated is that there's been a lot of attention about confidence that Republicans have held in the mass public about elections. But I think it was important that Democrats in 2020, 2021 believed election officials could do no wrong. And a consequence of that was it really drove Democrats in blue states to adopt a whole lot of reforms and expansions of voting in those states. That election officials have been scrambling with, how do we deal with more voting by mail, more election day voting, more this and more that in those states. Okay, so that's been unremarked. Now, 24, what we've seen is now kind of this mixture of these two dynamics. Democrats are still a bit more irrationally exuberant, but they're not quite as exuberant as they used to be at the state level. Republicans are not as grumpy as they used to be, except unfortunately in Arizona. They're still pretty grumpy. They're coming back toward the middle. And a little bit, and you were seeing a return of this kind of in-party, out-party dynamic in the states as well. But I think that, so this is a long, shaggy dog story, but it's like, the lived reality of election officials to the degree that their jobs are made easier or harder because of the reservoir of trust of distrust in the state has really changed in the states. It's more likely to be driven by national events rather than local events, and particularly in the battleground states, where voters oftentimes really kind of don't care how the state is doing it. They're just taking cues from national figures and then fitting that to whatever the dynamics are in the state, whether it's appropriate or not. So I'll end there.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's appropriate or not, indeed. So Seth, do you want to take that one on? I feel like you've got a really interesting perspective on all of the things that Charles just talked about, because you're not only a Republican in a very blue city, that is a blue city that has become sort of synonymous with Republican claims of voter fraud. So I think that's a really interesting place for you to take all of that voter trust data that Charles just went over.
Yeah, well, Philadelphia is the most populous county in a very important swing state. So we are always going to be at the center of attention in many ways in presidential election years. And I've been doing this for a long time. I served 10 years as deputy commissioner to now Secretary of the Commonwealth, Al Schmidt, who was city commissioner. He was the Republican in Philadelphia before me. And I've been serving as commissioner now for 4 years. So we've seen this dynamic play out, not just in 2020, but we saw it in 2016. And as Charles said, the losing side had less faith in the result there. And we actually had challenges from Jill Stein and the left because Hillary Clinton lost Pennsylvania in 2016. And then in 2020, we had all of the claims about the mail ballots in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia in particular coming from the Republican side of the aisle. So as things are kind of getting into a groove with the new dynamics and then playing into each other and having the 2024 election, my biggest concern is that the increased faith in elections that we are seeing, this balancing out where in 2020, the Democrats were very exuberant, as Charles said, the Republicans had no faith, and that faith on the Republican side has increased. My fear is that it is only because President Trump won, and that it is not a sustainable trust in elections going forward. Because what we saw in Philadelphia, in my own experience, was in the evening, while polls were still open, then former President Trump said that there was massive cheating going on in Philadelphia with no proof, with no explanation. And we had to defend against that accusation in real time. And then when polls closed and the results started coming in, there was no mention of it. So we're dealing with this dynamic where we are defending the integrity of the work that we're doing and the elections in Philadelphia and across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and the country. And oftentimes there's no actual evidence that is cited for why they're saying they don't have faith in the election. It seems to me to be just about the results. And we have to do a lot of work on the ground as elections officials to try and counteract that. But at the end of the day, it takes the leadership from both sides to have cooler heads and to actually look at what's really happening. It's the same dynamic in my mind between the violence that we've just seen over the last couple of weeks with the murder of Charlie Kirk, and how we need cooler heads from both sides of the aisle to tone down the rhetoric and prevent violence. And we need to see the same thing here with elections, because the rhetoric related to elections can also lead to violence. And we saw threats in 2020. We saw a lot of harassment in 2024. And we need to find a way where we can build faith in elections from what we do on the ground, but also our leaders at the national level need to take action into their own hands as well.
And how concerned are you that they're not? I think that it's not really debatable that that at least most of our leaders are not pulling back on the rhetoric there. Do you see the daily implications of that, and is it getting worse on the ground?
We do. The way I see it playing out in real time is the impact that that rhetoric has on state legislatures. And what I see is the national rhetoric from party leaders filtering down and being repeated by legislators who are then trying to pass laws that will actually make election integrity worse or make it harder for elections officials to run the elections at the county level. And at the end of the day, those proposals are happening because of the national rhetoric. Now, in Philadelphia, as I said, I'm the Republican commissioner on a 3-member board. So I am talking to Republicans at the local level every day. And they have faith in our elections because of the relationships that we're building. But as Charles said, that doesn't mean they have faith in the elections for the county next door or the state next door. And it takes really tough conversations to try and build that trust out beyond just who they know and what they know. I mean,
Okay.
even one quick example, my dad grew up in northeast part of the city, blue collar, union carpenter, votes Republican quite often. He had faith in Philadelphia's elections in 2020 because his son was running the election. And he said, well, I don't know what's going on down in Georgia. How do I know that they didn't steal ballots down there? So even somebody who intimately knows people who run elections, they still need to have interactions with elections officials and try and build that trust.
Yeah, I see that on a daily basis. I think my own parents, they're like, "Well, how do we know?" And I'm like, "I run a whole newsroom that talks about this, Mom and Dad." And they're like, "Well, that's you." So I sympathize. Karen, you were in charge of a really interesting state in terms of sort of balancing counties and their abilities to trust each other. There are 100 counties in North Carolina, and they range in size from, the Research Triangle to rural Western North Carolina. So how did you manage that? How did you think about, explaining the processes in urban areas versus rural areas versus suburban areas?
That's having uniformity is a real key to election administration, not just in North Carolina, but across the country. And I think, Seth alluded to it. When you're with others from our profession, we talk about this. We network together, and we look for ways to improve our processes. And so, in North Carolina, where you have the smallest county, Terrell County, with about 2,500 registered voters, that's a small precinct in Wake or Mecklenburg County, our largest counties, with pushing over 800,000 registered voters in those jurisdictions. But at the end of the day, there's a number of things that go into play. For example, we have a certification program for voting equipment in North Carolina, so that every county, those systems are vetted. The code is held in escrow. There's a bond requirement for all of the vendors, and there's a series of tests, even, and demos that are part of that. Even the procurement process, and those standards are maintained uniformly across the state. We have logic and accuracy testing. We spend a lot of time in North Carolina talking about how we conduct elections so that people have trust in the processes because they know the story. And logic and accuracy testing is one of those. Since 2006, there's been a uniform process in North Carolina on how to test every piece of voting equipment and every component and every position on the ballot and every ballot style. And I can go on and on and on about all the checks and balances put in place before any of that equipment or those ballots are deployed to a voting site. And then the same is in effect post-election. Every single county receives a random selection of at least 2 voting groups or voting methods that they have to sample hand to eye count to prove the accuracy post-election of that voting equipment. And that's conducted by bipartisan officials. And so when you know that you've got that going on in Eastern North Carolina and Western North Carolina, in the middle of the state, large and small, that's showing the integrity of the North Carolina system. And many of these practices are in place in other states. And so I don't try to single North Carolina out in our practices. But, the fact that 98% of the country has paper ballots, a paper record of those transactions. North Carolina's had that in place since 2006 as part of that certification program. The list goes on and on, but there's a lot that we try to do uniformly so that the voting experience for North Carolinians is really nearly identical no matter where they might live. If they're mobile in going from rural North Carolina into the urban areas, or if they've been in college and then go back home, the process should be very similar. And we do this, the state board and the executive director have oversight. We issue numbered memos. There's rules that are adopted into the administrative code. So there's a lot to keep the guardrails there for no matter the size of the county.
Great. Okay. And that looks very different to, we have some questions coming in about that in the Q&A. That looks very different from other states. Like I'm sitting in Texas right now and there's basically no uniformity from county to county. And I know that that's the same in Pennsylvania. So I think, Seth, I'd love for you to take this. How do you think about public trust in a state in which you can't enforce that kind of uniformity, and your explanation for, how things happen in Allegheny County versus how things happen in your county are necessarily different?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest challenges we have in Pennsylvania right now is our election law had serious amendments in 2019 called Act 77. And we, for the first time, had no excuse vote by mail added as an option for Pennsylvania voters. And this happened before the pandemic, although we had to implement it for the first time in 2020. And how each county was able to implement that and the varying degrees of resources that they had to run an election in the pandemic and make it so that their voters in their county can vote was challenging, and also was handled differently in many different counties. And that is one of the biggest complaints I hear, is the lack of uniformity in Pennsylvania when I hear about concerns that people have with Pennsylvania's elections. So what we try to do is emphasize a lot of things that Karen just talked about for North Carolina. We emphasize that every county does logic and accuracy testing. In fact, in Philadelphia, logic and accuracy testing is going on right now. It just started half an hour ago in Philadelphia for this upcoming election. Every county has to do that. After each election, every county has to do an audit of their ballots. We do 2 audits in Pennsylvania. We do a 2% audit. So we count at minimum 2,000 ballots by hand to audit them to make sure that those results match the records from the tabulators. And we do an RLA, a risk limiting audit, across the country. And it's those requirements that we point to try and talk about uniformity. Every county is going to be different when it comes to whether or not they have drop boxes, or how many polling places they have, how much they pay their poll workers and are able to recruit and staff their polling places with poll workers. That's true. It was true before Act 77. It's true now. The amount of resources that are appropriated by the counties to run elections has always varied and always will vary. So we try and point to those integrity measures that we all share to talk about the uniformity.
That's a really great solution, but thank you for that. Charles, I'd love to go to you. We had this really interesting question submitted as part of the registrations, and it was essentially, should we tell people more about elections? Do they want to know more about elections? Do they want to know about these processes? And if they did, would that increase trust?
Yeah, so the first thing, I mean, depends on which people you're talking about. Right, so there's lots of people and lots of different kinds of people. Um, so if we're thinking about just the mass public doesn't care. Mass public doesn't care. But what's important is parts of the non-mass public do care. And there's a principle of public opinion that goes back almost a century now, and I still teach my students this. It's called the two-step flow of political communication. For most issues and for most voters, they live a blissfully ignorant life, right? I mean, and they should. Politics should not be the most important thing to most people most of the time. And so they rely on people they trust, as I mentioned earlier, to make sense of things that they generally don't pay attention to. And this two-step flow model suggests that in general, for low salience matters like election administration, they rely on, well, maybe the president, maybe the governor, but more likely they rely on maybe their, politically active neighbor, maybe the precinct captain, maybe the Kiwanis Club president, maybe the pastor of their church. There's a set of people who are kind of in the middle part of the kind of social hierarchy, who are attentive, go to rallies, go to meetings, they get a buzz. And I would argue that the research, and there's some new research about this as well, the research suggests it's those people with whom communicating is really important for two reasons. One, they're in the network of folks who can make life really miserable for Seth and the others, right? They're the ones who will, file the lawsuits. They'll get the groups to come, and they'll do they're the ones who foment the rebellion or foment the trouble.
They're coming to the meetings. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, no, exactly. And if they don't get people to the meetings, the people don't come to the meetings, right? So it's kind of that level. And it's that level of communication that's really, really important. And so back to the question, should we tell people more? That's an empirical question. I mean, and in the following sentence, it's an empirical question, and there are trade-offs, right? So for instance, take the suggestion that we have 24/7 video of counting rooms and those sorts of places. Okay. On the one hand, intuition tells us that having that radical transparency is going to be good. On the other hand, experience tells us that the more fodder that you have, the more fake videos, the more opportunities to spread fake information are abound. Okay, so which is it? And there's people doing research on this. I don't know actually the research on the videos, but for instance, there's research being done on what I call petting zoos, more officially facility tours, right? Which are, I mean, really, it takes a lot of work to do facility tours, right? It's a lot of time.
Gave me a facility tour in Philadelphia not 6 months ago. So maybe not a fully in-depth one, but yes, I understand. Mm-hmm.
So, and intuition is that for this middle level of people and for journalists and others, this is a good thing, right? These are the people communicating out. But one, does it work? I mean, does it really change attitudes? And then for someone like Seth or another local official, given the amount of trust you might build, is it still worth the effort, right? those are the trade-offs, and research is being done about that. And in fact, and Seth, right, Thad Kauser and his colleagues at UC San Diego have been doing studies along those lines, and they're discovering that yes, doing something like that does bolster understanding and trust in elections. So that's good to know. There's other things that intuition would tell us are good, and they turn out not to be good. For instance, high production value videos that describe the process appear not to work.
Oh,
Videos that I call the hostage videos do work. That is,
that's
videos
amazing.
of the Secretary of State. In fact, there's a classic one from Texas, just sitting with maybe a iPhone in a warehouse with a bunch of books, just talking to the camera about what we do here in Texas or wherever. It's authentic. It's straightforward. That seems to work. And so, I think so. Yes, um, greater transparency. And as an academic, I want everything to be transparent. I want all the data. I want all the everything. But I
Same.
think for policymakers and all of that who are trying to decide, and for the public and for county commissioners and all of that, I mean, there are trade-offs. There's not infinite resources. And, I think it's worthwhile. Um, so on top of the requirements of the law, going out and telling the story is valuable. But there's some things work and some things just don't work, and some things are actually there's a backlash to them. And that's one of the areas in which I think it's important for researchers like my tribe and election officials like Seth and Karen's tribes work together to try to think these things out.
Great. Okay, so I want to, we're closing in on the last third of our hour here. So I want to direct the conversation towards something that I think that we all keep kind of naturally coming back towards in all of our answers, which is that we're all kind of worried, a worry that I share, that this renewed trust in elections is just a factor of President Trump winning the 2024 election, right? And let's say that the Republican doesn't win in 2024, Charles. Is this all just going to go right back to where it was, or does the data suggest that we actually are sort of like on an uptick?
Well, I would share Seth's concerns that we're again, who knows, right? We have to run the experiment, but it does look like we're on this kind of winner loser bubble. And I do worry about places that are close, and in 26, um, you know, kind of things that are similar to 2020 could reemerge because of close elections and distrust about the way people do things. Certainly, and we've also observed over the last 6 years now that both sides, the skeptics and the non-skeptics, have honed their ability to advocate in this environment. So I would have said, when people ask me about 2020, I say that, the thing about 2020 is that all the guardrails held, all the fact-based institutions in America did the right thing. Sometimes a little delay, but they all did the right thing. I'm still confident in 26, those institutions will do the right thing, sometimes because some of those guardrails have been built up, but I'm a little more worried. And in part, it's not just that it's not just that we're riding this bubble of win and lose. But one feature that we haven't talked about is that there are now social movements that have risen up, grassroots social movements that make their money by fomenting dissatisfaction, selling pillows and books and things at seminars and those sorts of things as well. But they're really, and those people, those groups are in place now. They weren't really in place in 2020. So even if we've solved the voter confidence issues, the kind of the capacity of groups to work the system and to flood the zone with lawsuits or with demonstrations and those sorts of things, I think are greater in 26. And then finally, the worry that I have is that even if things are better right now, even if things would be better with respect to confidence, the midterm election in 26 that we're coming up to is going to be more geographically dispersed.
Mm.
And so, you know, there wasn't a big backlash in California in 2020 on the presidential race, but I would bet there's going to be activity in California congressional races in 2026, right? And so there's just going to be a lot more dispersion of things. And so I think here, this is where kind of confidence is one of the inputs into the sorts of kind of chaotic dynamics that we're seeing. And even if confidence gets better, there's the rest of the process that leads to the chaos that we observe, that I think situation is, kind of dicey these days.
Okay. That's troubling. But I do, I want to, my tone suggests that this is going to be a more optimistic question than ultimately it is. So let me just reset. I also want to acknowledge that these doubts, this sort of anger around election results does exist on the left. I get emails from folks on a daily basis that talk, yeah, I'm sure you do too, Charles, that talk about, for example, Rockland County in New York and the lawsuits that are happening there. And Charles, I know that you've taken an in-depth look. You and I have both written about Rockland County, and there is not a there, but it's still sort of being used by people on the left to sort of sow the same seeds of doubt that people on the right have been sowing for the last few years. And so, given that you're in sort of a right-leaning swing state, Karen, I wonder how this impacts the folks on the ground in North Carolina. I'm sure that they hear, just statistically most often from people on the right who have these doubts. But what do they look like on the left, and how are election administrators answering those questions?
Oh, Jessica, this was a question I was waiting for. Because whether we look at it as a left or a right issue, at, I came into the state executive director position because of a new election that was called around CD9, Congressional District 9, and ballot harvesting, and trying to restore trust in the election process at the start of my tenure, and then to end my tenure with a state Supreme Court seat that was decided by 734 votes. The outcome was changed once provisional ballots were considered. These are very complex parts. You're talking about a contest that is down ballot in terms of people's understanding of what someone does on the state Supreme Court and that sort of thing. And yet what we really faced, and so many states have faced now, is a lack of a willingness for a candidate to concede. And so there was a lot of national attention once again on North Carolina of how would that play out, because there was an attempt in the lawsuits following that election to change the makeup, the rules of the game after the game had been held. And we get all geeky and we talk about the Purcell principle and so forth, but North Carolina was case in point of, the recounts had happened, the, transparency was there, the data was there. People could understand that this election had been conducted fairly, yet the candidate did not concede until May of 2025. And it went through, it was political, or excuse me, legal, court ping pong of whether it was in state court or federal court, or which level of the courts, before it was ever decided. And so often, I can even see some of the questions that are in the Q&A for this webinar. It's a lack of understanding to the history of elections. North Carolina has been purple before purple was a thing. I am a North Carolina native. I know oh too well we had one of the most conservative U.S. senators in Jesse Helms serving at the same time as, one of the more progressive governors that North Carolina's ever had with Jim Hunt, who served 4 terms. And so that just speaks to North Carolina voters. I'll go back to the fact that I mentioned we now have more unaffiliated voters than affiliated with either party. That tells you that North Carolina voters, we don't even have straight party voting as an option anymore because they go in and they mark their ballot to their personal preferences. And so, we make our data, there's more data available in North Carolina than any other state. And so, citizen data analysts can get in and dig in, but I need everyone in North Carolina and elsewhere to be mindful of what they are looking at, and to understand the history. We're heading into midterms. History tells us typically midterms take a swing, and we'll vote in a Congress that doesn't line up with the president. And we can go back historically and see that. And so very similarly, when North Carolina and other states elect one person of a party for president and then a different person of the other party for governor, look at the history of it. It's not out of the norm. And it's not out of the norm to see ballot drop off either. And that's something that we spend a lot of time talking about is why did so many people vote for president, but then they didn't vote for county commissioner?
And you know
Because
what?
the county commissioner they couldn't break through with the advertising.
And it's so interesting to watch the Q&A because we actually have a former Rockland County commissioner asking questions,
Yes.
and I love Votebeat so much.
Yeah.
Kristen, reach out. I want to talk to you. But for purposes of right now, I think that it's important to sort of note that the phenomena you're describing with sort of like historical voting patterns, even if they seem strange, can be tracked over time. And that is one of the reasons, Charles, that you are confident that everything is fine in Rockland County. So why don't we give the folks on this call who are not sort of like, Rockland County, what is that? Where is that? Right? Why don't you give them a little bit of a rundown on why we're all satisfied that there's nothing going on there?
First thing I would say, check out my Substack, playing with election data. And there's an essay in there. And the bottom line is that Rockland County is, and actually in some ways it's similar to some of the dynamics in CD9 as well, generically so. Um, Rockland County was identified as a place where there was basically a lot of votes for no, I'll get this wrong, kind of Democratic areas that were either not voting for president or voting Republican for president. And it was
But not for the senator, right?
not for the senator. Thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks. And not for the senator. And this was seen and is still seen by some people as evidence that there was something wrong with the counting of the votes.
Because people assume, if you're going to vote for Kristen Gillibrand, you're definitely going to vote Democrat for president.
That's right.
No way you wouldn't do that. But actually,
there's enclaves in Rockland County of very conservative Jewish voters who kind of have a history of kind of this sort of behavior. And there are other parts of New York. The village of Kiryas Yoel is another place that has exactly the same patterns. And interesting, a different county and different voting machines. And so, and the locals in Rockland County told this political story. We can then, because the data are transparent, we can look at this other place. Exact same thing is going on. Exact same dynamics are going on. So again, check out the Substack. And there's some other folks at Harvard and other places that have gone digging deeply into this. But Karen's point that there are anomalies as Tip O'Neill, sitting in Cambridge, every election is local, right? And although politics has gotten more national, there are local dynamics sometimes that you really have to pay attention to. And some of these really weird anomalies, sometimes it's weird, Sometimes something went wrong, but usually it's because there's a long history of some sort of dynamic like in a small community that can, that can explain things very easily.
Great. Okay. Final question for everyone, since we've got 5 minutes left. I'll start with Seth. Since you are in fact the acting election official among us, what's your strategy ahead of 2026 to continue building trust with the people that you serve?
Yeah, in my experience, it's that one-on-one conversation. So as Charles said, and you experienced when you came to Philadelphia, giving tours of our facility does make a difference to the people who are seeing it in real time. Um, Also, getting people to get involved as poll workers. I know I saw in one of the Q&A comments, Jeff Greenberg, former election director in Pennsylvania, now works at with the Committee of 70, which is a great organization in Philadelphia. He makes a great point, which is the more people you get involved, whether it's as poll workers or volunteers at the election warehouse, the more people who experience running elections, the better we are. So working to get that expanded and have more people get involved between now and 2026, and then between then and 2028, I think will make a difference to the best of our ability. It is, as Charles said, about weighing the cost and benefit of the amount of time that you're putting into it and the resources, and how many minds can you change on that one-on-one level for the amount of time you're putting into it. But that is what we are in Philadelphia elected to do. That is what we're here for. And if we're not working every day as hard as we can to make that difference, then why are we here? So we're going to keep pushing in that direction. We're going to keep trying to build trust in elections for everyone. And we're just going to take it day at a time and keep fighting.
Great. And then Karen, from a statewide perspective, how would you encourage election directors in other states, and I guess your successor in North Carolina to move forward towards 2026?
Well, I definitely echo Seth's point and one that was made in the Q&A. Become a poll worker, get involved, and once you see the processes, you see the it would be the makings of a movie for the kind of collusion that would have to happen. We've seen that in some TV shows, but nonetheless,
TV shows,
all that sort of stuff,
crucially.
those are make believe. Go see what the real process is about, and how the nuts and bolts and the where the rubber meets the road. But what I do know, a couple of things. One, we did a tremendous amount of you know, free efforts. We posted to social media. We did some of the man on the street kind of videos. We provided tools to the counties so that they could tell their story. We had our hashtag, Your Vote Counts NC, so that people could begin to, it is in the nuggets that we could provide, understand the complexity that make for about a 4-inch law book on how you have to conduct elections. And probably one of the hardest charges to any of us on this today is, so much of the world talks in sound bites, and yet it's a complex system where you can't. And so we don't have the most sexy comments that get pulled out onto social media. We're up against that, but we do have a lot of the processes that are available for public viewing. And so I think, making sure that that's known and getting people involved is critical. For example, there's a question in the Q&A that's about how are provisionals considered. Okay, that's a whole nother webinar that could take, just as much amount of time. But the meetings in North Carolina where those provisionals are reviewed are public. So go see how that process works. Look at the rules and the procedures that are published so that you can so that everyone can understand, what's the criteria and how that's applied across the state of North Carolina, and how those provisions are in place in other states, to understand how that whole process works. And then again, I think other states we found it so successful, to put out press releases, to make sure people knew when public meetings were happening, to do the social media to try to put things in nuggets so that folks understood all the layers and checks and balances that are in place to ensure safe and secure and accessible elections in North Carolina and across the country.
Sorry, my dog was barking, so I muted myself. Charles, last word to you.
Your dog was just agreeing with me, Jessica. That's what it was.
He was just emphasizing your points. Yeah, absolutely. Charles, what are you going to be looking at most closely as we approach the 2026 election? I know you kind of have this great 10,000-foot perspective on elections. So what most interests you between now and 2026?
Well, I mean, both as an election administration student, but also a student of just elections in general. I mean, I think that I'm interested in at a general level following things like turnout, the activity of candidates, and because it's the interest of voters that gets many of them to the polls. But ultimately, it's the campaigns that bring people to the polls. And I think that, sitting here almost a year, more than a year out, we're in a hot political climate. Will we continue to be in a hot political climate? How will that affect the candidates who are put on the ballot, challenges and primaries, and how is that going to feed into turnout in 2026? We're still trying to see what's going to happen with redistricting. I mean, this is kind of a disease that's spreading around the country. No vaccine for it, as far as I can tell. And so, how that's going to affect things. And then finally, I think the big unknown is what happens after the election. And is this going to be a repeat of 2020? As I mentioned earlier, with higher capacity and greater knowledge about how to work the system. I have another. I won't bore you with it, but come to my Substack in the next couple of years. I'm also a political historian, and in the late 19th century, which was a period very much like the present, and there was a lot of activity, post-election activity, in counting and verifying votes for president and Congress in that period. And I'm looking to see whether we have a repeat of 1890s elections when it comes to the post-election period. But
I will look forward to your book on that. That's yeah,
I
don't
have
know
a
how
book. I
big
can
the
pull it off the
audience for
shelf.
it would be, but I am in it. So that sounds awesome. Okay, we are now 2 minutes over. So I so appreciate all of your time. And if you were in the audience this whole time, thank you so much for giving us your lunch hour on this Friday. This has been a really interesting panel. We're going to keep doing events like these, so please stay tuned. And if you're not already, please subscribe to our newsletters. They go out on Thursdays for local newsletters and Saturday for our national newsletter. Thank you all for coming.